So in this budget special, you've heard the thoughts of myself, Emma and Harrison. For someone that probably has more experience and expertise than all of us put together in analysing federal budgets is AMP Capital's Chief Economist, Shane Oliver, who has been kind enough to share his thoughts. G'day, Shane. Nice to have you on the Savings Tip Jar again.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Good to have you here, Shane. Now, the budget is aiming, one of the measures of the budget is to lower measured inflation through cost of living subsidies, such as this $300 energy rebate, for example. How effective do you think these measures will be in this current economic environment?
Look, I think they will help. They certainly helped in the last year. The ABS, does record the impact of those subsidies as a reduction in the price of, say, electricity. And so consequently, it's led to lower inflation than would otherwise have been the case. Federal Treasury has estimated a reduction equivalent to about 0.5%. Now, of course, there's a limit to the extent you can do this. If you can just disappear inflation by subsidising everything, then maybe the government could do that. But, of course, they'd run out of money to do that sort of thing. It'd blow the budget. And, of course, it's really just a bit of a trick with mirrors in some ways. The inflationary pressure is still there. It's just that it's been subsidised or reduced. But that said, you can't ignore it. I mean, the CPI measures the cost of living, the consumer price index. People are paying a lower price when there's a subsidy in there. It does get measured by the ABS and will knock about 0.5% or so off inflation over the next 12 months compared to what otherwise would have been the case. That's a very rough estimate, but that explains why the government is forecasting, say, 2.75% inflation for the next year, whereas the Reserve Bank is forecasting, I think they had a number of 3.2%. Or thereabouts. The difference is really those subsidies. The Reserve Bank assumed that they would end in June this year, whereas the federal government's just announced they'll be continued. So I think it will help. It's not a perfect solution, and hopefully you can't just keep subsidising everything forever because, we will run out of money. But by the same token, it will help get inflation down at least for the next 12 months.
Shane, but isn't that, essentially artificially lowering inflation, just paying for it to go away rather than addressing the underlying cause of it? And if so, could that effectively buy the government an RBA rate cut later this year, as some have suggested?
Well, there is an element of trickery there. There's no doubt about that. It's reducing the measured rate, but it's not actually reducing underlying inflation in the economy. Inflation is always a phenomenon. As Milton Friedman, who was a well-known economist, famous in the 1970s, once said that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. It's due to too much money chasing too few goods. So the money is still out there. It's still chasing too few goods and services. So that problem is still there. But by the same token, we measure inflation by the CPI, Consumer Price Index. And if it measures lower inflation, then that can have a positive effect. You do get a lower CPI. That affects inflationary expectations. It affects wage demands. It affects prices that are indexed to the CPI, such as bus fares, train fares, and so on. And so in that sense, it can help. But it's not a long-term solution. Long-term, we have to get productivity up. We have to make sure that demand in the economy is more in line with supply in the economy. So it's really more of a stopgap measure. It's not a permanent solution to getting inflation down.
The budget outlined $24 billion in net new spending over the next few years, with 80% of that happening in the next 2 years. But given our current issues with inflation, shouldn't that be the other way around? So we have less spending in the next 2 years and then more spending later on once we've tamed inflation?
Yeah, I think that was a bit of a disappointing aspect to the budget, that we have a budget surplus this financial year, the one we're in right now, but it ends in 6 weeks' time. But we've still got a bit of an inflation problem as we go into next year. So ideally, it would have been better to see the budget have a surplus this year and a smaller deficit for next year. In the event they've gone on, spent a lot of money over the next 12 months, and the deficit next year is actually bigger. So that's the Achilles heel of the budget. On the one hand, the cost of living measures will help reduce measured inflation. On the other hand, they're spending a lot of money, partly on those cost of living measures, pumping more money into the economy, which could undo the impact of the cost of living measures. So that's why it's a bit of a mixed bag. On the one hand, I'd say, well, yes, inflation will come down. On the other hand, there is a risk around that. So that makes it a bit difficult, I think, for economists to assess this. In terms of my budget rating, how does it help in terms of managing the economy? I thought it was like a 5 out of 10. On the one hand, the cost of living measures help get inflation down, good for the RBA. On the other hand, the extra spending will add to inflation, bad for the RBA. So that's why it's a bit of a mixed bag in the great scheme of things.
No doubt they had the upcoming election in mind when forming this budget. I mean, they're hardly going to have a very, much an austerity budget with a big election to come up. But just on the RBA a little bit more, do you think this budget is enough to change anyone's, forecast for when the first cut, or perhaps even, whether there's going to be a hike later this year, as, our previous guest, Warren Hogan, has suggested? I can't remember exactly what your forecast was for the next RBA move, Shane, but has it changed your forecast at all for when the first cut will occur?
No, it hasn't. We sort of thought about it a little bit, and we thought, well, our forecast for inflation this year was already below where the RBA was. We thought the RBA overreacted to the March quarter inflation numbers. The government's numbers are more in line with our own forecasts. You could argue that the cost of living measures were broader than we're assuming, so maybe we should lower our inflation forecast. But then there is that extra spending in there, which sort of offsets that. So in the end, we concluded, well, there's no reason to change our forecast or our interest rate view. Our interest rate view prior to the budget was that there would be a rate cut later this year, either in November or December. I know earlier in the year we were thinking it would occur by the middle of the year, but obviously the high inflation numbers have put an end to that idea. But we still think that as we go through the rest of this year, inflation will come down. That will enable a rate cut to occur around November or December. I know some out there are saying, well, we need to raise rates more, but I think that would be a silly thing. The Reserve Bank is right to say that they've already done enough. We have not raised rates as much as in the US or New Zealand or UK or Canada, but by the same token, households in Australia have seen a bigger increase in their mortgage payments than in those other countries, or at least most of those other countries. In fact, we're well bed. The only country which has seen a faster increase in actual mortgage rates paid is Norway. And the outcome of that is being seen in consumer spending in Australia, which is not accelerating, it's slowing down. We've now seen 5 of the last 6 quarters, retail sales went backwards in real terms. The last 7 quarters, retail sales have gone backwards in real terms on a per capita basis. So people are cutting back here. And that ultimately, I think, will put more downwards pressure on inflation and ultimately enable the Reserve Bank to cut interest rates later this year. I mean, it's not without risk. We've got tax cuts coming up. Some of that might be spent. The government has pumped more money in, so that's a risk as well. But I think the broader picture will be one of falling inflation, heading off the need for any rate cut or any rate hike. Obviously, it could just mean, well, rather than November, December, it turns out to be the rate cut comes in February or March. Yeah, I can see that's a risk. But I don't see a need for further rate hikes.
Touching on housing, what is your assessment of the budget allocation of $9.6 billion for housing and crisis accommodation? Do you think this will be enough to address the housing supply and affordability crisis that we're under at the moment?
Probably not. I think the government just wants to tick that one off and make it look as if they're doing more on housing. Some of that money was a Morrison-era program, which was just rolled over. It wasn't new money. Some of the stuff for accommodation for victims of domestic violence was new, and there was some infrastructure stuff in there, but the number was exaggerated. The other issue is I'm not entirely sure that throwing money at the issue necessarily solves the housing crisis. There's a bunch of things you need to do. One is speed up the development process for new properties. Secondly, state governments and government generally needs to get in there and I think ensure more social and affordable housing. You can do that and you grant approval to a developer to put up a block of 40 units, of which 10% have to be social or affordable. That's the way to do it. Speed up the development process if you include social and affordable in the mix. Land release programs need to be looked at. We need to look at ways to encourage less Australians wanting to live in our big capital cities. Office workers don't all need to be in cities. I know they're more exciting and all that sort of stuff, but we can live in a more dispersed way like Americans do. I know you think of big American cities, but they all have lots of cities which are mid-sized cities. And we need to look at that. We also need to look at making sure we match the level of immigration to the ability of the home building industry to supply more homes. So there's lots of things that can be done, but it's not necessarily involving throwing more money at it. I know there's another proposal out there that maybe young people should be able to access their super to buy a home. But anyone can tell you that if one young person does that and the next young person will do that and they'll all do it, and that will push up the prices by the amount they've taken out of their super, and my generation will feel wealthier because our prices will go up. So I can't see how that's going to benefit anyone either. It's not something we just throw money at. You've got to limit the underlying demand, slow down the level of immigrants to a sustainable pace consistent with the ability to supply new homes, and make it easier for developers to supply new homes, and make sure there is a good mix in there of social and affordable housing. To get to the 240,000 homes a year, or 1.2 million over 5 years, we have to have smaller homes in there. They can't all be standalone houses. That's going to be impossible. The only time we ever got close to that was in about 2017. In the unit building boom, when everyone was counting the cranes across Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne and Perth and elsewhere. And that's the way you've got to go. We've got to put more higher density stuff in there, but a lot more units in the mix. And within those units, social and affordable stuff in that mix as well. But we also got to make sure we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. You know, we want more affordable homes in Australia, but we don't want everyone stuffed into a ghetto either. We don't want to go down the path of Europe where every property goes up 5 stories and there's multiple units in there. And I think that partly destroys the Australian way of life. So got to get the balance right here. But I think there is a way out of this. But unfortunately, the budget wasn't going to solve that.
Yeah, I suppose housing affordability is such a major issue that it's never going to be fixed in one budget. It's obviously going to involve a lot of collaboration from all levels.
You've got to give these guys credit, though. They have put more effort in than I think previous governments have. They seem to be more focused on it, more aware of the need to boost supply. So I'd give them full ticks for that.
There you go, Shane Oliver, stamp of approval. We're out of time, I'm afraid, Shane, but really appreciate your insights as always. Thanks so much for joining us on the Savings Tip Jar podcast.
My pleasure, thank you.